we're going to transition into a bit of a talk around some recovery, and we want to take a look at 3 of the most popular recovery trends that are out there. And we'll turn to our resident expert in all things recovery, Professor Halson, to go through some of these trends and take a look of, are they legitimate, are they overhyped, or somewhere in between? So maybe if we can pull up one of the popular trends people have asked about, and that's infrared sauna.
Maybe a little bit overhyped. We don't have a huge amount of science in this space, but I think this is a really good example of just because you might do something in the recovery period post-exercise doesn't always mean it's a recovery strategy. So what I mean by that is 10 to 15 minutes in the infrared sauna might make you feel pretty good, might make you feel quite relaxed, quite nice. I don't mind it myself. But spending 30 or 40 minutes in an infrared sauna might be a whole other story. A passive stress, dehydration, that ain't recovery. So I think we need to be a little bit careful about some of the durations and the types of things we're doing in that recovery period.
Fantastic. Let's turn to our next potential trend that people have asked about. Smart recovery clothing, which I think is probably colloquial terminology for around compression garments that people might use as recovery. So in the area of evidence around compression garments, what do we see?
Yeah, so this is another example of recovery strategies that come from the medical world. And we think, right, it'll work for patients, so maybe it'll work for tired athletes or athletes that need to recover. So there's a little bit of science around the benefits of compression, the idea that it constricts the peripheral vessels and forces the blood flow through the deeper vessels. But there's lots of good evidence on compression garments for perception of recovery, enhancing the perception of recovery, enhancing the perception of improved or reduced soreness. So there's a bit of science there. So I would say pretty legitimate.
Okay, and let's turn to our final one. Good old ice baths.
And we're going to talk about this a bit in a minute, so I won't go to town too much because I could. I think we need to think about short-term goals, and are we working with athletes? Like, are we in congested schedules with Clare's athletes versus an everyday person who is, not performing, or somebody who's maybe in Dr. Helm's world who are bodybuilding? That's probably a different story. So thinking acute and short-term goals versus longer goals, adaptation, etc. 2 different stories. So lots of good evidence for acute benefits, not a lot of good evidence for longer-term adaptation, which is where we need to be careful. So I'm kind of going to sit on the fence on this one.
Right. Let's turn to our discussion, maybe get into some of those details. We're going to have our next little segment around recovery scores, which of course a lot of athletes using it in some way or have come across different devices or algorithms that might help them. And Professor Halson, with this area, we have now huge amounts of data, huge amounts of consumer-facing technology that's available, many that use different recovery scores or algorithms to help people guide not only what they should be doing after training, but even their training itself. Can you maybe give an insight into the bit of context we need to be aware around this and what evidence we see in the use of things like a recovery score someone might get from a device?
Yeah, recovery scores are really tricky because most of the companies, and I understand why they don't, but they don't tell you how they calculate these scores. Now, typically, we kind of reverse engineer, and we know that sleep and sleep duration in particular plays a really important role in those recovery scores. Now, those algorithms would not be developed for an athlete, right? They're probably developed by 20-year-old Silicon Valley techs, males probably as well. So we don't really understand the algorithms in terms of what goes into them. I think it doesn't help an athlete to wake up in the morning and see a bad recovery score because potentially that might not actually influence their performance, but it may influence it negatively by seeing a score that we don't know is accurate. For me, what I'm much more interested in is if I might measure everything. If I get a low recovery score, I'm more interested in looking at the metrics that contribute to that recovery score with the data that I've got. So what is it that's making my score low? Or alternatively, what metric is it that's making my score high?
So if we do take a step back, you mentioned sleep is one of those core factors that would impact someone's recovery. Can you maybe talk just generally from an overview of some of those main other contributing factors that influence someone's recovery?
Yeah, so in terms of recovery scores, the other things that would go into that, of course, we have sleep duration. We may have sleep quality for some of them. So some devices will measure architecture or stages of sleep. Heart rate and heart rate variability will also often go into those scores as well. And most of the devices will measure heart rate and heart rate variability pretty well.
Great, and we'll dig into some of that. Jeet, if I come to you, when you're dealing with clients and maybe fielding some of their questions they have around their recovery, or maybe they come to you and say, I saw this post on social media around recovery, what do you think? What are some of the most common things they're asking you about?
Well, when it comes to like recovery part, a lot of people say that, I'm training really hard, I'm eating well, and I'm not recovering. So the first thing which I say that, are you sleeping well? So that's the, making things simple is my, agenda all the time. So I said, are you sleeping well? Do you have a good mattress? Do you have a good pillow? So fix that thing. Are you taking a lot of stress? Are you happy in your life? So all these little things which contribute to the recovery part when it comes to sleep. So I focus on all that. And then I come back to the nutrition part, like, what sort of food you're eating. Is it, good enough for you? Is it enough for you? The micronutrients, the quality of food, what sort of food you're taking. Some people take, like chicken, which is, I would say like not up to that mark, because I always ask people to go either free range or, better quality chicken protein sources. So it just adds in a little, small little things. So this is what I usually tell people to, focus on rather than, just contemplating on other things.
Great.
Yeah.
Professor Phillips, if we think about these things that influence recovery and specifically focus in on nutrition, most people probably accept, nutrition is important, but what specifically about nutrition is playing a role in recovery? If we have a hierarchy of the things that matter most, what are actually directly helping us recover?
Yeah, I spend a lot of time trying to explain to athletes that all the training that they do is fantastic, but all the good stuff actually happens in recovery, because if you're going to rehydrate, you need to do that first. If you need to refuel, there's the carbohydrate aspect that we've talked about a little bit already. And then the remodeling and the repair aspects, so the trinity of the 3 R's, if you like, are really some of the concepts I hammer with athletes. And to explain to them that you need to have all of those things dialed in the recovery process for recovery to make you better to perform, either if it's later in the day, for sure you need to get those things if you're doing 2-a-day workouts, or for the next training session. So, or if it's a hard week that you're planning, you need to do something, and your game really needs to be dialed in to have that recovery process support you in the next training session. So, recovery is where all the magic happens, if you like. And I think it's really important for athletes to realize that. There's a term, overtraining is one, and I could flip it around and say, oh, it's under recovery, if you like. I mean, it's really two sides of the same coin. But the whole idea that athletes, and sometimes coaches, forget a little bit about how important recovery is. But if you're not sleeping well, if you don't have your nutrition dialed, I mean, all of these things are going to compound and make you less able to recover and to be able to perform. And 3 matches in 1 week, if you're a premier level football player, that's a tough one, right?
And maybe, Claire, we can piggyback off that, and maybe you can go into some of that context around that recovery process of how you think through it, particularly in a hectic schedule like you have now. What are some of the components that you specifically have to plan for? What are those variables that are at play with the chaos that is elite sport?
Yeah, so I think touching on what Professor Halson and even Professor Phillips is after saying, I think sometimes for elite athletes, it's I suppose the most attractive thing for them is the trendy stuff that goes on. And what about this? And doing their compression or going straight for the sauna or going straight for the infrared sauna. Rehydrating can be a challenge before they actually look at the bigger picture of our biggest pillars that we know work for recovery, and that being refuel with carbohydrate, repair with protein, rehydrate with your fluids, and then sleep is a huge one. So there are kind of our non-negotiables of recovery. But I guess my job is, how can I influence the athletes to be convinced by this, to buy into the strategies and do it in a fun, different way that they will actually comply with. So while we start with the non-negotiables, and that might come from, as I said, coming off the pitch, you're trying to get a tasty drink or a tasty smoothie that includes your protein, carbs, rehydration in there. You're then, like on a game day, for example, when appetite is low, I'm trying to include like picky bits is what I call them. Often the players hate to see a big, massive meal. The last thing they want is a big steak dinner after a game at 11 p.m. at night. So we're trying to include carbohydrate, protein sources, different shots, shakes, different sources that basically can kind of tick all boxes depending on how that player or athlete feels. So often we go for the likes of bao buns or duck pancakes, or even the likes of like some garlic bread, different sides like that. Arancini balls are a great one. Athletes then like to nearly pick on these while choosing their main, and it's a way of nearly tricking calories, carbs, protein in before they actually sit down to their meal. So already they might have got a 30 gram protein hit, or even 10 grams of protein, for example, depending on it, and a 30 gram carbohydrate hit before sitting down to their main meal. So it's about nearly tricking and sneaking calories in. Alongside that, we do use some additional recovery nutrition supplements. I suppose in elite sport, we don't really have the luxury of waiting for a large body of work to come out to fully support a supplement. And we do know there's quite a lot of recovery trends out there. My approach when it comes to these type of supplements are, if there's no harm involved, there's no toxicity risk, there's no side effects, there's no potential harm in a supplement, for example, the likes of tart cherry or curcumin even, that we don't have enough evidence to say this definitely works, or this definitely reduces muscle soreness, or this definitely can, reduce inflammation between games or between training or between sessions. However, by supplementing, there is no harm involved, and there might actually be a benefit. For example, take tart cherry. The benefit, even if it doesn't help recovery, it's still getting some nice antioxidants in, or still supporting that kind of 5 to 7 plus a day that we're trying to aim for. So that's kind of my approach when it comes to even the likes of collagen for a tendon ligament injury. A little bit of mixed research behind it, a lot of conversations around it. It's not going to do any harm. So we're hoping it works, because we're looking for these 1%ers, and there is some nice emerging evidence around some of these. So yes, we do include these in strategies, and particularly in these really important recovery windows, short turnarounds. Even omega-3 is another one. Use that, and often we do see in athletes, they do have a low omega-3 profile. A lot of them don't like fish. We face a lot of picky eaters. They don't like the smell of fish. They don't like the taste of fish. They love meat. They love chicken, but do not like fish. So I suppose our job is to try and find ways of getting omega-3 in, not from fish, but even with supplements, I face some issues that I can't swallow the size of that supplement, the size of that pill. Oh, it's going to go down the wrong way. This is what I hear. So we're trying to find ways of, okay, if you don't take the pill, if you don't eat fish, how can we get it in? And, maybe it's through using drinks, or it's through using different sources. So yes, we try use as a holistic approach as possible, going after our sleep, nutrition, and then there's obviously the other recovery modalities used, but it's a whole MDT approach here to try get recovery and buy-in from the players, and keeping it fun, keeping it new, keeping it exciting, keeping different sources, and keeping everybody basically ticked from all angles.
Yeah, that's a tremendous point, and I think it speaks to the idea of that evidence-based practice that maybe is sometimes misunderstood, that we want to be evidence-based, but it depends on what context it's being applied. You might do one thing with trying to get that 1% from an elite sport context, but it's not to say you would make those same recommendations to everyone should prophylactically use this, because it might not be worth that potential risk. So that's really, really interesting to use. So maybe to round this out, Professor Phillips, when we do come to some of the evidence we have from the nutrition side, what would you say are like those top tier things that everyone, even if they're just training generally, can do that we know from nutrient-wise that they should tick off?
Yeah, I come back to those 3 R's, right? So rehydrate, refuel, and repair. The repair part is really, that's what I study. It's what I think is really important. You're going to notice that over the long term. So that's high quality protein and as close to the proximity of finishing exercise as you can, but obviously throughout the day as well. So to Jeet's point that he made earlier. So
fantastic. Professor Halson, then when it comes to some of the things that we see that are promoted around recovery and some that have good evidence. Can you maybe remind us in around that hierarchy of things that you would say from an intervention standpoint are definitely going to be useful to include as part of recovery, and then some of the ones that you might think have lesser quality evidence?
Yeah, so I think, and when I talk to athletes, I talk to them about this recovery pyramid that you can see there, and the basis of it is that the strategies that we have most information on, and that's sleep and nutrition, and that should be a foundation. I put sleep at the bottom of the pyramid thinking it's a little bit more important, and the only reason I do that is because we spend more time in a 24-hour block of time doing that. But I absolutely agree that nutrition and sleep are the foundations of good recovery. And then we move up into some of the other strategies that have good evidence, but ice baths, compression, massage, those kinds of things where it's not as strong, but we've got some evidence. And then at the top, we've got some of the other strategies that are just, there might be fads or there's minimal scientific evidence. So if an athlete comes to me and says, I want to do some sort of strange recovery strategy that they've seen on the internet, I'm like, well, how are you sleeping? How are you eating? Are you doing your other things right? And then if that's the case, and as Claire said, if we don't think it's going to cause any harm, you go for it. But if they're not doing the foundations and the fundamentals right, doing a 10 to 15 minute recovery strategy a couple of times a week is not going to help them. And one of the biggest issues is, and Claire was talking about behaviour change and trying to get people to do things, is especially things like prioritising sleep. It's not seen as cool, right? It's not seen as the new fancy gadget that's going to solve all your problems. But there is nothing like sleep to solve all your problems. So I think just getting that information across that. There's strategies that you can do, but let's get these fundamentals of good sleep and good nutrition right.
One of the things that people ask about in relation to the recovery scores specifically is the risks that some people buy into that number too much on one specific day, right? They see a number and it comes in low and then think that means, I can't train today because I won't be able to recover, or rather than seeing it as maybe a useful piece of information. Now, in many cases, it can correlate quite well, but there might be that risk of making choices that you otherwise wouldn't make. Is this something that you've seen in practice with athletes, and how would you warn them against that?
Yeah, there's a few different things that you can do. I mean, different devices, if you've got certain software, you can actually restrict what the athlete sees on the app. So you can get them to only see the things that you think are important and relevant, and often will take the recovery scores out of the picture so they don't see it. I also tell athletes to, one, don't compare it amongst themselves, because everything's a competition, right? If you're an athlete, it's a competition. So they compare among teammates. I suggest don't do that. And look for long-term changes. So especially when it comes to sleep, which is, as I said, one of the fundamental variables that goes into these scores, let's not pay attention to one bad night. Let's look at, okay, if you're having 3 or 4 bad nights and you're starting to see your scores change, then maybe that's worth looking at. So looking at longer term changes within yourself. But I will say that personally, experience for me is once I woke up and I felt terrible, and I was waiting to look at my app to see how badly I slept or how bad my recovery score, and it was super high. And I'm like, what's going on here? And I was working down at the tennis. It was Melbourne. The Aussies in the room know it's hot. And I was just dehydrated. I felt terrible because I was dehydrated. And I was going to my scores and I was like looking for my scores for the answer. And I was like, no, you just need to drink a little bit more. So I think there are times when it can work in the positive direction as well. That can work in the negative, but it can work in the positive to make you go, okay, well, I'm understanding maybe what's contributing to the scores, but if there's nothing there, what else might it be?
Fantastic. Jeet, is this something you've seen in your own training or with clients, the use of recovery scores in both positive or maybe not so positive ways?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there is some evidence, as we have been discussing a lot. But again, coming back to the same point, I always say, hey, don't focus on all these. Just focus on the simple things, which is your sleep, your diet. And, if something is benefiting you, for example, taking some sort of, because, for example, if you talk about like back in India, there are a few people, those who are focusing on taking Ayurvedic herbs, for example, ashwagandha and shilajit. Yes, they could be very little evidence in supporting in the recovery part, but there's no harm in taking something which, doesn't give you any sort of side effects. So that's one thing which I always ask people to, if you are taking all these things right, sleeping well, eating well, add these kind of things as well sometimes and see how it works in your body.
Great, thank you. And as we conclude this session, maybe a round of applause for our experts here.